My name is Angela Reynolds. For 34 years, I believed my husband, David Reynolds, was the most honest man I knew. That probably sounds ridiculous now. Looking back, I can see the warning signs scattered throughout our marriage like broken glass. The excuses, the secrecy, the way he always changed the subject whenever money came up. But when you're in love with someone for more than 3 decades, you stop looking for reasons not to trust them. Trust becomes automatic, like breathing, and that trust nearly cost me everything. When David and I got married, we had almost nothing. I was 24 years old and working as a receptionist at a small medical office. David was a junior sales representative trying to build a career. We lived in a tiny apartment, where the kitchen was so small that only one person could stand in it at a time. We struggled. We sacrificed. We worked weekends. We skipped vacations. We postponed dreams. But we did it together. Or at least that's what I thought. As the years passed, David's career took off. He moved into management, then executive leadership, then consulting. His income increased dramatically. We upgraded from the apartment to a small house, then from the small house to a beautiful home in an upscale neighborhood. Everyone around us thought we were successful, but inside our marriage there was always one strange contradiction. David acted like we were constantly on the edge of financial disaster. Every time I suggested a vacation, he would shake his head. Not right now. Every time I talked about remodeling the kitchen, he would say, maybe next year. Every time I mentioned retirement plans, he looked uncomfortable. We need to be careful. Those words became his favorite phrase. We need to be careful. At first, I admired his discipline. I thought he was protecting our future. But after years of hearing the same thing, I started wondering why our financial situation never seemed to improve despite his growing success. One evening about 6 years ago, I sat across from him at our dining table. The table was covered with bills and paperwork. I remember looking at him and asking a simple question. David, how much do we actually have saved? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a sip of coffee. Then another. Finally, he said, enough. I laughed. I'm serious. So am I. Why won't you tell me? His jaw tightened. Because numbers aren't important. I remember feeling confused. Of course they're important. He stood up. Conversation over. That should have bothered me more than it did, but I convinced myself he was stressed. That's what wives do when they love someone. We explain away things we shouldn't. Years passed. Life continued. Birthdays, anniversaries, family gatherings, holiday dinners. The ordinary moments that create a marriage. And through all of it, David maintained complete control over our finances. I never had access to investment accounts. I never reviewed tax returns. I never questioned his explanations. I trusted him. Then came the day everything changed. It started with something incredibly small. A missing document. My sister had called me needing information related to our late mother's estate. I knew I had the paperwork somewhere. After searching the house for nearly an hour, I remembered David's office. His private office. The room he spent countless hours inside. The room where he handled all financial matters. The room he rarely wanted anyone entering. I walked down the hallway and opened the door. The office looked exactly as it always did. Dark wood paneling. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. Expensive leather furniture. Perfect organization. Everything in its place. It felt more like a law firm than a home office. I searched through several filing cabinets. Nothing. Then I noticed a drawer inside his desk. Locked! That surprised me. David rarely locked anything. I wasn't trying to invade his privacy. I simply wanted the estate paperwork. Fortunately, I knew where he kept spare keys. Within minutes, I had the drawer open. And that's when my entire life began to unravel. Inside was a collection of bank statements. At first glance, they appeared ordinary. Then I noticed something strange. The account numbers weren't familiar. Neither were the institutions. I pulled out another statement, then another. Then another. My heartbeat started accelerating. The balances didn't make sense. One account contained nearly $400,000. Another showed over $600,000. A third contained even more. My hands began shaking. I checked the names on the accounts. David Reynolds. Only David Reynolds. No Angela Reynolds. No joint ownership. Nothing. Just him. I sat down heavily in his leather chair. For several moments I simply stared at the numbers. trying to convince myself I was misunderstanding something. Maybe these were business accounts. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe there was a mistake. Then I found the transfer records. Thousands of dollars moving between institutions. Large deposits. Large investments. Transactions stretching back years. Years. Not months. Years. My stomach dropped. Suddenly dozens of memories resurfaced. The vacations we never took. The renovations we postponed. The dreams we delayed. The constant warnings about being careful. All while David had been hiding money. A lot of money. Far more money than I ever imagined. I should have confronted him immediately. I should have demanded answers. Instead, I carefully returned everything exactly where I found it. Then I locked the drawer. Then I walked out of the office. That night I barely slept. David lay beside me peacefully, breathing steadily, completely unaware that something had changed. I stared at the ceiling for hours, questions racing through my mind. How much money was there? How long had this been happening? What else was he hiding? The next morning I watched him leave for work. The moment his car disappeared down the street, I returned to the office. This time I searched more carefully. Every drawer, every cabinet, every folder, and buried inside a stack of business documents, I found something that made my blood run cold. A property record. Not one property. Three. 3 properties, all purchased under companies I had never heard of. Companies connected to David. Companies that didn't include my name anywhere. My hands started trembling again, because by that point, one thing had become terrifyingly clear. The secret bank accounts weren't the entire truth. They were only the beginning, and somewhere inside that house, David was hiding something much bigger, something he never intended for me to find. What I didn't know then was that within weeks, I would discover a hidden wall safe containing millions of dollars, and before David ever realized I knew the truth, I would place something inside that safe that would destroy the life he had spent decades building. My divorce papers. For 3 days I said nothing. Not to David, not to my friends, not even to my sister. I carried the secret alone. Every morning I woke up beside him. Every evening I sat across from him at dinner, and every time he smiled at me, every time he kissed my forehead, every time he asked how my day had been, I felt something inside me breaking, because the man sitting across from me wasn't the man I thought I married. He was a stranger who had spent years building a hidden financial empire behind my back. The worst part wasn't even the money, it was the deception. The realization that while I had trusted him completely, he had been living an entirely different reality. One built on lies. I tried to convince myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe he planned to surprise me someday. Maybe he was protecting us, karma. Maybe there was some complicated financial reason I didn't understand. But deep down I already knew the truth. Honest people don't hide millions from their spouses. The following Monday, after David left for work, I made the most important phone call of my life. A divorce attorney. Her name was Karen Mitchell. She had spent more than 25 years handling high-asset divorces. When I explained my situation, she listened carefully. She didn't interrupt. She didn't react dramatically. She simply took notes. When I finished speaking, there was silence. Then she asked one question. Angela, how certain are you that this is all the money? The question caught me off guard. What do you mean? What you found may only be a fraction. I felt my stomach tighten. A fraction? It happens more often than you think. I suddenly felt cold. Karen continued. If your husband was willing to hide accounts, he may have hidden investments, properties, trusts, partnerships, or businesses. I sat quietly, trying to process what she was saying. Then she said something I would never forget. Do not confront him. Why? Because the moment he knows you're aware, he can move assets. The seriousness in her voice frightened me. Then what do I do? You gather evidence. That afternoon I hired her. The next day she introduced me to a forensic accountant, a man named Robert Ellis. Robert specialized in tracing hidden wealth. After reviewing the documents I had found, he immediately noticed patterns. Patterns I never would have seen. Transfers, shell entities, investment structures, accounts connected to accounts, money moving in circles. The deeper he looked, the more concerned he became. 1 week later he called me. His voice sounded unusually serious. Angela, are you sitting down? My heart immediately started pounding. Yes. I've identified over $3 million. I nearly dropped the phone. 3 million. I couldn't speak. Robert continued. And we're not finished. $3 million. The number echoed inside my head. For years, David had claimed we needed to be careful. For years, he had rejected vacations. For years, he had made me feel guilty whenever I spent money. Meanwhile, he was secretly sitting on millions. The betrayal became impossible to ignore. I cried that night. Not because of the money, because I realized my marriage had been built on a foundation of dishonesty, and once trust disappears, everything else follows. Over the next month, Karen and Robert worked quietly. David remained completely unaware. In fact, he seemed happier than usual, which somehow made everything worse. One evening he brought home flowers. The gesture would have touched me once. Instead, I stared at them and wondered whether guilt had finally started, creeping into his conscience. "What's wrong?" he asked. "Nothing. You seem distant." I forced a smile. "I'm just tired." He accepted the answer, because he never imagined I knew the truth. Weeks passed. Then one afternoon everything changed again. I was reviewing copies of financial records Robert had uncovered when I noticed a recurring reference. A location, a room, an internal security invoice. The invoice mentioned maintenance on a concealed wall safe. My eyes locked onto the document. Concealed wall safe. Immediately I thought of David's office, the room he guarded like a fortress, the room where he spent countless hours alone, the room where nobody was supposed to ask questions. Suddenly everything made sense. The next morning I entered the office once again. This time I wasn't looking for documents. I was looking for secrets. For nearly an hour I searched bookshelves, cabinets, wall panels, artwork. Nothing. Then I noticed something strange. One section of wood paneling near the rear bookshelf looked slightly different from the surrounding wood. Barely noticeable, but enough. I stepped closer, touched it, pressed lightly. Nothing. Then I found a hidden latch. My pulse exploded. The panel shifted, slowly, silently, and behind it was a massive steel safe. I froze. For several seconds I simply stared, unable to believe what I was seeing. Karen had been right. There was more, much more. The safe itself was enormous. Large enough to hold years of secrets. I couldn't open it, not yet. But its existence changed everything, because now I knew with absolute certainty David hadn't merely hidden money. He had created an entire secret world. A world designed specifically to exclude me. When I told Karen, she wasn't surprised. When I told Robert, he wasn't surprised either. But I was, because despite everything I had discovered, some small part of me had still hoped there would be an innocent explanation. The safe destroyed that hope. Weeks later, Robert called again. This time his voice sounded almost shocked. "Angela, what is it?" "We've crossed 7 million. I closed my eyes. $7 million. I remembered all the arguments, all the sacrifices, all the promises. $7 million. Hidden, lied about, protected, not from strangers, not from criminals, from me, his wife, the woman who had spent 34 years beside him. That was the moment something inside me finally changed. The sadness began transforming into determination. The tears became resolve. The confusion became clarity. I wasn't going to beg for answers. I wasn't going to plead for honesty. I wasn't going to give him an opportunity to manipulate the truth. I was going to prepare, carefully, quietly, legally. And when the time came, I was going to walk away. The divorce papers were finalized 2 months later. Karen handed me the completed documents during a private meeting. I stared at the thick stack of papers. 34 years reduced to signatures. Terms, assets, evidence, consequences. The sight made my chest ache, but it also gave me peace. For the first time in months, I felt in control. That evening, David attended a charity gala. He would be gone for hours. The house was silent. I waited until his car disappeared. Then I walked into his office. My hands were steady. My mind was clear. I approached the hidden panel, opened it, and stared at the safe. This time I knew the combination. Robert had uncovered it through records tied to a security company. Slowly, I entered the numbers. The lock clicked. The heavy door swung open, and my breath caught. Stacks of cash. Neatly organized, shelf after shelf. Investment records, property documents, gold coins, financial statements, evidence of years of deception, millions of dollars. Karma. Far more than I had imagined. I stood there silently, looking at the fortune David had hidden from me. Then I opened my folder, removed the divorce papers, and placed them directly on top of the money, front and center. Impossible to miss, impossible to ignore. The words faced outward. Divorce papers. I stared at them for several moments. Then I closed the safe, closed the hidden panel, and walked out of the office. David still had no idea. He had no idea his secret was no longer a secret. He had no idea the investigation was complete. He had no idea the woman he thought he had fooled for years had already won. Most importantly, he had no idea that the next time he opened that safe, his entire world was going to collapse. The morning after I placed the divorce papers inside David's safe, I woke up feeling different. For months I had lived with uncertainty, fear, heartbreak, questions. Now those feelings had been replaced by something else. Control. For the first time since discovering his lies, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was preparing. David, on the other hand, had no idea what was coming. At breakfast, he sat across from me, reading financial news on his tablet. His coffee steamed beside him. His expression looked relaxed, comfortable, confident. The same confidence he had carried for years. The confidence of a man who believed he was always the smartest person in the room. I watched him carefully, every movement, every expression, searching for any sign that he suspected something. There was nothing, not a single clue. "Any plans today?" he asked. I smiled. "A few errands." He nodded. "Try not to spend too much." The comment almost made me laugh. After everything I had discovered, hearing him lecture me about spending money felt absurd, but I simply nodded. The old Angela would have felt guilty. The new Angela felt nothing. Later that afternoon, I met Karen and Robert. The investigation was entering its final stages. Karen spread several folders across a conference table. The amount of evidence was staggering. Bank accounts. Property records, tax documents, transfer histories, corporate filings. Everything pointed toward one conclusion. David had intentionally concealed millions of dollars throughout our marriage, and the evidence wasn't just strong, it was overwhelming. Karen leaned forward. "He's going to have a very difficult time explaining this. Do men ever try?" I asked. She smiled. "Every single one." Robert opened another file. "Actually, we found something else." I immediately felt my stomach tighten. "What now?" He slid a document toward me. At first I didn't understand what I was looking at. Then I saw the number. I stared, blinking several times. Surely I was reading it incorrectly. I wasn't. The hidden assets weren't worth $7 million. They were worth substantially more. For months we had only been uncovering pieces. Now the entire picture was becoming visible. The total value of the concealed assets exceeded $11 million. $11 million. The room became silent. I felt physically ill. Not because of the amount, because of what it represented. Years of deception. Years of manipulation. Years of deliberate dishonesty. I remembered every conversation where David insisted money was tight. Every vacation cancelled. Every purchase questioned. Every dream postponed. $11 million. Hidden while pretending we needed to struggle. The betrayal felt larger than ever. When I returned home that evening, David was grilling dinner on the patio. He looked up and smiled. Perfect timing. I forced a smile back. The sight of him still hurt. Not because I loved him, because I remembered loving him. There was a difference. The man I loved had never existed. He had been a carefully constructed illusion. Over the following weeks, something interesting began happening. David started noticing changes. Not the investigation, not the attorneys, not the evidence. Me. For decades I had organized my life around his preferences, his schedule, his opinions, his approval. Now I wasn't doing that anymore. I stopped asking permission. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped seeking validation. The difference was subtle, but noticeable. One evening he looked at me across the living room. "Is something bothering you?" "No." "You seem distant." I looked up from my book. "Do I?" "Yes." I smiled slightly. "I'm fine." For the first time in our marriage he looked uncertain. And that uncertainty continued growing. Small moments, tiny observations, questions without answers. The more independent I became, the more uncomfortable he seemed. He just couldn't understand why. Because he was asking the wrong question. He thought something was wrong. What he failed to realize was that something was finally right. Then came the day everything changed. It was a Thursday. I remember because rain had been falling since sunrise. The house felt unusually quiet. David had spent most of the morning inside his office. I was downstairs reading when I heard footsteps moving above me. Nothing unusual. Then silence. Several minutes passed. Still silence. Then, suddenly, a sound. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just the faint metallic click of a safe opening. My heartbeat immediately accelerated. I knew, instinctively, David had opened the safe. The moment I had been waiting for had finally arrived. I sat perfectly still, listening. Seconds passed. Then another. Then another. The silence felt endless. Finally I heard movement. Heavy movement. The sound of someone stumbling backward. A chair scraping against hardwood. Then nothing. Absolute silence. I slowly closed my book, set it on the table, and waited. 5 minutes later, David appeared at the top of the staircase. I almost didn't recognize him. His face had lost all color. His eyes were wide. His expression looked frozen, like a man who had just watched his entire future disappear. He stood there staring at me, unable to speak, unable to move. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then he walked downstairs. Slowly, mechanically. Every step seemed heavier than the last. When he finally reached the bottom, he stopped several feet away. His hands were trembling, actually trembling. I had never seen David Reynolds afraid. Until that moment. Angela. His voice sounded weak. I looked up calmly. Yes. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. He looked like a man searching desperately for air. Finally, he managed to speak. You went into my safe. It wasn't a question. I closed my book. I did. His eyes widened further. The admission clearly shocked him. For years he had controlled every conversation, every situation, every outcome. Now he was standing in unfamiliar territory. Truth. What did you see? I laughed softly. The question was almost insulting. What didn't I see? His shoulders dropped. For several seconds he simply stared at me. Then came the panic. Real panic. Not anger. Not frustration. Fear. Pure fear. Because he finally understood something. The money wasn't the problem. The lies were. And there was no explanation capable of fixing them. I stood, looked directly into his eyes, and for the first time in months, I said exactly what I was thinking. You hid $11 million from me. His jaw tightened. Angela. No. His voice died immediately. You've lied to me for years. It's not what you think. I almost smiled. Every guilty person says that. Every single one. What exactly should I think, David? Silence. What explanation makes this acceptable? Nothing. For once, he had no answers. No excuses. No clever arguments. No control. Only consequences. Then I watched his eyes change. Because suddenly he understood something even worse. If I had found the money, I had probably found everything else. The accounts, the properties, the transfers, the records, the evidence, every secret, every lie, every hidden piece of his empire. The realization hit him all at once, and I could actually see it happening. The safe hadn't simply been opened. His entire life had. And sitting on top of those millions of dollars, waiting exactly where I had left them, were the divorce papers that proved I was no longer asking questions. I was leaving, and for the first time since the day we met, David Reynolds understood that he was no longer in control. The courtroom was quieter than I expected. After months of investigations, legal filings, financial audits, and sleepless nights, I thought the final hearing would feel dramatic, Instead, it felt inevitable. David sat across the room beside his attorneys. For the first time since I had known him, he looked small. Not physically, emotionally. The confidence that had once defined him was gone. The arrogance that had protected him for years had disappeared. All that remained was a man watching his carefully constructed world collapse around him. I sat beside Karen, calm, prepared. Ready? The judge entered. Everyone stood. Then the hearing began. At first it was routine. Financial records, property disclosures, asset statements, legal arguments. But then Karen began presenting the evidence. One document after another. Hidden accounts, secret transfers, undisclosed investments, concealed real estate holdings. Every piece connected perfectly. Every lie documented. Every secret exposed. The courtroom grew noticeably quieter with each new revelation. The judge reviewed the files carefully, occasionally glancing toward David. The expression on his face became increasingly difficult to ignore. Disappointment, disapproval, concern. At one point, the judge removed his glasses and looked directly at David. Mr. Reynolds, these assets should have been disclosed years ago. David shifted uncomfortably. His attorney attempted to explain, attempted to minimize, attempted to create confusion, but the evidence was overwhelming. There was nowhere to hide. The truth had become larger than any excuse. As the hours passed, more details emerged. The hidden companies, the concealed property purchases, the millions of dollars transferred through accounts I had never known existed. Every new disclosure strengthened my case, and weakened his. By lunchtime, even David seemed to understand what was happening. This wasn't a battle anymore. It was an accounting of consequences. For years he had believed he controlled the narrative. Now the facts were telling the story instead. The turning point came when Robert testified, methodically, professionally, without emotion. He walked the court through the financial trail. Every dollar, every transfer, every hidden asset. The evidence was impossible to dispute. When he finished, the courtroom sat in complete silence. The judge slowly closed the final report, then looked directly at David. These actions demonstrate a clear pattern of intentional concealment. The words landed like a hammer. Intentional concealment. There it was. The truth reduced to two words. Not mistakes. Not misunderstandings. Intentional. David lowered his eyes. For the first time in 34 years he had nowhere to run, no story to tell, no one left to manipulate. The hearing continued for several more hours, but everyone already knew the outcome, including David. When the final ruling was announced, I felt a wave of emotion wash over me. Not joy, not revenge, relief. The judge awarded me a substantial portion of the marital assets. The concealed wealth had not protected David, it had damaged him. The very secret he believed made him powerful had become the reason he lost so much. As people began leaving the courtroom, David remained seated, staring ahead, motionless. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then I remembered every lie, every manipulation, every sacrifice he had demanded while secretly accumulating millions, and the sympathy disappeared. Outside the courthouse, sunlight filled the afternoon sky. The air felt different, lighter. For months I had carried anger, heartbreak, betrayal. Now those feelings were finally beginning to fade. Karen smiled as we walked toward the parking lot. You did the right thing, I nodded. For the first time in a long time I truly believed that. A few weeks later I returned to the house one final time. Most of the legal matters had been settled. The divorce was official. The marriage was over. I walked through each room slowly, remembering birthdays, Christmas mornings, family dinners. The life I once believed was real. Some memories still hurt. Others made me smile. But none of them controlled me anymore. Eventually I found myself standing outside David's office. The room where everything had started. The room that had hidden so many secrets. I stepped inside. The bookshelves were still there. The desk. The leather chair. The wood-paneled walls. Everything looked exactly the same. Except now I knew the truth. I walked to the hidden panel, opened it, and looked at the safe one final time. Months earlier I had stood in that exact spot holding divorce papers. Heartbroken. Terrified. Uncertain. Now I felt something entirely different. Peace. Because the safe had never contained David's greatest secret. The money wasn't his greatest secret. The accounts weren't his greatest secret. The lies weren't even his greatest secret. His greatest secret was believing I would never find out. He underestimated me. And that mistake changed everything. I closed the safe, closed the panel, and walked away. Forever. As I stepped outside, sunlight warmed my face. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about what